This is Morrison's Mustang. Join us on a vision quest to find the Blue Lady, a 1967 Shelby GT500 Mustang, the only car Jim Morrison ever owned.
Doors fans, if you're heading out to the Sunset Strip tonight, be on the lookout for a cool blue Mustang. The Lizard King has lost his ride, and maybe you can help him find it.
I'm Leo Mixon, and I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a complicated young man and one of the few material possessions that he treasured, his car. It's a story about love and success and loss and death. And, I'm sure there are a million stories like this playing out all over the world every day. But this story was different because this young man was Jim Morrison, the iconic lead singer of the seminal 1960s group, The Doors. And that car was a night mist blue Shelby Mustang. Now, to tell this story, I guess I should start where the story started for me. See, I've been a car guy since some of my earliest memories. The fact that those memories were being built when a 8-year-old used car could still be a big block Corvette or a 440 Barracuda or even a Shelby Mustang. It was just past the end of the muscle car era. Now, most people are going to peg the muscle cars starting with the Pontiac GTO in 1964 and interestingly ending with the 1974 Super Duty 455 Trans Am, also from Pontiac. You could argue that the horsepower wars between the automakers started in the 50s, but most of those motors were going in full-size cars. This was a departure. It was a pretty simple idea, though. They just said, we've got a mid-size car called the Tempest, and we've got this 389 V8 in the full-size Bonneville. Let's put the big V8 in the Tempest and call it the GTO. It's kind of funny. One of the young engineers that was working on the GTO that helped bring it to life was infamous designer John DeLorean, who would later create his own sports car that became an icon when it was used in the movie Back to the Future. And then John would run into some problems with cocaine smuggling. But back then, he was just a young engineer, and he helped put that car together. Now, the GTO sold like mad. And pretty soon, everybody in Detroit was scrambling to put a big motor in a small car. Now, you got to keep in mind, small is a relative term. Small as we think of it today in cars didn't really exist at this point. These were mid-size chassis. So Oldsmobile jumps into the muscle car wars with the Cutlass 442. They took the B09 Police Apprehender Pursuit package, which came with a 330 cubic inch V8. And this is something that kind of became a bit of its own mythology. Police interceptor packages. It's kind of hot rodder lore that the police got special high performance equipment that nobody else could get. You'll often hear the Dodge 440 or the Ford 428 referred to as a police interceptor or police pursuit special or some such thing as that. And while the police packages were generally pretty powerful, a lot of the equipment was built more for longevity, and it was heavier. It wasn't as great a performance. Bigger cooling systems, heavy-duty suspension, stuff like that was as important as a big motor. But back to the 442. The 442 wasn't called that because of the engine size, but because it had a 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, and dual or 2 exhaust pipes. So that was kind of the first counterpunch in the muscle car wars. Now, after that, everybody's jumping in. Plymouth put a big block 383 in their fastback Barracuda, and And Dodge went even a little further and offered the monster 426 Hemi in their Charger. Chevrolet's little Chevelle got a 396 big block, and the Ford Mustang would even get a 390 big block for it. By 1970, the muscle car wars had hit a crescendo, but they were all about to get both kneecaps broken by brutal 1-2 combo. Prior to adopting parts of the metric system, American engines were measured in cubic inches. And at the end of the muscle car era, there arose a saying, "There is no substitute for cubic inches." Well, that's wrong, of course. Boost. Anything that boosts the intake charge is a substitute for cubic inches, specifically. But that's a different story. Anyway, suffice it to say that it was kind of a race for who could put the biggest cubic inch number in a muscle car. Now, Chevrolet hit 454 cubic inches, or 7.4 liters in 1970. Ford topped out at 460, or 7.5 liters. The Dodge Chrysler Plymouth group all used the same 440 V8 at 7.2 liters. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick all chose to meet at 455 or 7.5 liters. And luxury brand Cadillac topped them all with a massive 500 cubic inch motor. It was 8.2 liters. And, it didn't even matter if the biggest engine wasn't the most powerful, because in many cases they weren't. But people just wanted that big block. It was to a point where Oldsmobile, they were trying to recast themselves as a serious performance car creator. Oldsmobile comes up with the Mad Dr. Olds and his cast of characters, which are all the henchmen that help him build these insane Olds W machines, which were the upgrade on top of the 442 upgrade. But anyway, one of these henchmen was Elephant Engine Ernie. And Elephant Engine Ernie was going to drop a giant 455 into the Oldsmobile Cutlass. So, these were some big packages, and they came with some pretty hefty horsepower ratings as well. And it was getting to be a standard thing for your biggest engines to understate how much horsepower they were putting out, but quite a few were probably in excess of 500. Now, without getting too deep in the weeds here, the cubic inch or liter measurement on a motor describes the volume of space in the cylinders that you can fill with an air-fuel mixture. Bigger the number, more space, bigger bang, more power, generally. The first part of that equation isn't a problem, though. Air is free. Fuel, that you got to buy. If you like listening to your big block talk, you like to keep the pedal to the floor, you could count on your miles per gallon being in single digits back then. Now, the first time I remember seeing a price on a gas station as a kid, it was 37 cents a gallon. And that was before the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, put on their embargo. Now, OPEC is a group of leaders from Middle Eastern oil producers, and in the early 70s there was a big bunch of political nonsense going on about the U.S. removing the dollar from the gold standard, which just meant that the U.S. economy could move separately from the global price of gold, and a lot of the OPEC people thought that was going to destabilize the oil market. It didn't. But OPEC decided to draw a line in the sand, so to speak, and a lot of other issues were at work here. They were pissed off about other countries starting to drill and produce more oil. And pretty much in 1973, this all boils over, and people who have billions and billions and billions of dollars and can screw up everybody's lives out of spite decided to cause a global crisis. Now, remember where I said the end of the muscle car era was? 1974. Yeah, oil prices skyrocketed and gasoline followed. And that was when you could find gasoline, because OPEC cut production and stations regularly ran out. There were even there was a movie with Donald Sutherland called Gas that was about, the whole gas crisis and all the wacky things that grew up around it. It was that big of a cultural event. And I mean, you could see shots from helicopters of lines for blocks just trying to get fuel. And so with that going on, single digit miles per gallon wasn't going to cut it. So OPEC was the first part of that 1-2 punch I told you about. Second part was coming from the insurance industry. The insurance folks were quickly learning that putting vehicles with more horsepower than ever existed before in the hands of kind of impulsive car fanatics, that leads to a greater number of accidents. Now, insurance rates climbed faster than fuel prices, and within a few years, most of the V8s were under 200 horsepower. Now, I remember a friend trying to purchase a Corvette in the mid-70s and finding that the insurance would be nearly equal to the loan payment. I mean, think about that. As engines got smaller and smaller to satisfy the needs of both miles per gallon and insurance rates, the auto industry just pretty much gave up on making any serious horsepower for quite a few decades. Now, myself, I was modifying cars long before I had a driver's license. I loved helping my grandfather work on his cars when I was little. He was one of those larger-than-life people, and I thought he knew how to do everything. And he passed away when I was 11, and I came into possession of my first vehicle. It was a 74 GMC pickup with a 454 V8. Man, that did it. I was hooked for life. Now, we had some acreage out in the country, and I'd drive that truck around the fields and on the little country back roads, and I will tell you, it gave me an unrealistic expectation for what happens when you open the throttle. I thought any car you got into, you could just boil the back tires if you just push the pedal to the floor. Now, through my teens, I'd build several cars, a couple of trucks, and I'd race quite a few of them, both on track and off. And then there were some tangents into off-roading and autocross, but I guess in the end, sports car racing became my main passion. Now, after dabbling around in the fashion commercial industry back in my teens, I decided to go full-time into acting in the mid-90s. Now, I had heard all the old tropes about the entertainment industry, and I was just determined to find a better way. I mean, there's a really bad joke that when a server comes to your table in Hollywood, you should ask, well, are you a shitty actor or a shitty singer? And that is really unfair, to be sure, but I knew I didn't want to go that route. I wanted to find a different way to make a living while I was pursuing my career. So at the time, I was seeing someone who worked on stage and film production, but she worked both sides of the camera, so to speak. And so I decided then that my day job would be film production. And I figured the more I could learn about the technical side, the more competent I would be on the performance side. And I also had a commercial driver's license left over from a brief time selling fire trucks a few years earlier. Those are handy. That way I could drive and move anything around that needed to be moved on set. Now, the second production I worked on was Robert Duvall's 97 film, The Apostle. And on that shoot, I had a job in the transportation department. And I was chatting with the head of the department, and the subject was coming around to cars and car modifications and what I had done to the Corvette I was driving at the time and, what I knew about cars in general. And it was then I discovered that there was a position on film production called a picture car coordinator. And that's because any car that has a description in a film or TV script must be cast. Now, that description can be as simple as mysterious gray sedan, or it can be as specific as black Trans Am. Now, if the lead character drives it, it's called a hero car. the ideas for what the car should represent form part of the casting process, then what the car must be able to do on film, and finally what can be purchased or created for the budget you have. On the Apostle, Mr. Duvall had a very specific image of the car his character would drive. He said he wanted one of those Cadillacs that looked like the ass end has been chopped off. Now, I knew he was talking about the 80 to 85 Seville. And they were doing a really angular back end. I think it was supposed to look like an early 60s Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud on the back. But I asked him, did it have to be a Cadillac? And he said, oh, no, I don't care as long as it looks like that. So I knew that the early 80s Lincoln Continental, now the base model, not the town car or the Mark, had that same trunk. The Cadillacs that looked like that were mostly powered by the 4.1 liter V8. And unfortunately, that motor came with a lot of headaches. It was prone to overheating. It had aluminum cylinder heads that would warp when it overheated, and then you were in a lot of trouble with it. That little Lincoln, on the other hand, those were powered by Ford's plain old 302 5-liter V8. It's their workhorse. It was in everything from Mustangs to pickup trucks to everything. So it was cheap. It's easy to get parts for. You can beat them to death and they'll still work. So I went for the Lincoln. Now, something you find out as you're starting into film production, movies aren't shot in sequence. As you read through the script, it seems to be a cohesive story, from end to end, but you don't shoot it that way. And when there are conflicts as you're scheduling your movie, what you do is you fix the cheapest one. Because, obviously that keeps your budget right. Now, The Apostle was Mr. Duvall's pet project. And he had asked quite a few friends to play parts in it. He had Farrah Fawcett and Billy Bob Thornton, June Carter Cash, and Miranda Richardson, and Billy Joe Shaver. All of these people had busy schedules, but they had given days when they were available. Those days were not going to change. Now, the script called for Mr. Duvall's character to ditch his hero car by dumping it in the Mississippi River. It was a great shot. It came out really neat in the movie. You get to see the car hit the river with the big splash and the personalized license plate disappearing under the muddy water. But that scene was pretty early in the schedule. Now, that hero car that we just ditched was required several days later in the schedule. So I was going to need two cars that matched. Now, buying another $3,500 used car was much easier than rescheduling one of these stars. $500 worth of paint later, and I have one that matches perfectly. We had a lot of fun on that movie. I found an old blue Trans Am that becomes the new hero car. When Mr. Duvall's character borrows it to go out on a date, we found a 40 school bus that we used for the children's bus for his little rural church. It was a great shoot, and I learned so much on it. Not long after that, I moved out to Los Angeles and continued to work on both sides of the lens. I was still with the same partner, and we would marry a few years later. And I never stopped racing, so I was able to pick up some precision driving jobs here and there. I was also running a small vintage car brokerage out of my home with cars stashed in storage lockers all over Los Angeles. Now, when I retired for the first time, you can see how well that's working out, we bought a small ranch in the Texas Hill Country. And I opened a vintage car dealership over on I-35 and ran that for several years. And I had some old friends in the business that would come over and lease cars for me. That was it's always been my specialty to do period cars for specific time periods, so that everything on the street and in the movie looks right. But after the economic crash in 2008, I closed the dealership down and I started taking some acting and production jobs again. Once that gets in your blood, it's really hard to let go. While I was running the dealership in Texas, I was spending a lot of time in the car, and I was listening to a lot of audiobooks. And that was the first time I heard the story of Jim Morrison and his Shelby Mustang. Now, it was a book by rock biographer Stephen Davis. And while it was sprinkled with what I've come to see was quite a bit of speculation, it did have some good concrete info on this lost Shelby Mustang. Now, almost immediately an idea began to form about a search for this car. Filmmakers are storytellers. That's really what's at the heart of it. And true stories are even better. And man, this one had all the elements. It was the hero's journey. A hero raised to mythological heights. A tragic hero who didn't know where he ended and the myth began. A hero who shunned most material things except for his personal transport, which he named and mythologized in verse. A hero lost before his time. His treasured car lost as well. I mean, come on. How do you get any better than that? And having bought and sold vintage cars for most of my life, I knew the weird places cars could end up. Now, collectors are a very interesting breed. And I should say breeds because reasons for collecting are pretty widely varied. For some people, I think they just have an acquisitive nature. It seems like maybe they felt they were denied these things at some point, or they want to have a collection as big or as diverse as XYZ person. I see a lot of these big acquisitive collections like this. Someone will sell a company, get a lot of money. They'll go all over the country and pick up cars at auctions that are exactly what they wanted but couldn't have when they were younger. And they'll put them all in a warehouse somewhere, and they'll sit there until the gas all goes bad and the tires go flat, and then they'll go, hey, let's get these running and drive them around for a little bit. And they'll hire a mechanic to come in and get them all juiced up and running around, and that'll last about a month, and they'll go back to sitting in the warehouse and rotting again. Then you've got other collectors that are like the extremely wealthy collectors. Those guys like singularities. The one thing that no one else can have. I think of a Jerry Seinfeld type collector. He's got quite a few of his cars that he's shown off in his Comedians and Cars Getting Coffee. He's got a lot of singularities in his collection. And when you have that kind of wealth, you can do that. Now, others that I think are some of the more fascinating are these ones that have very narrowly focused collections. Now, I sold a 64 Galaxy 500 one time. It's a Ford with the 6-barrel 390. There's 3 2-barrels on top of the 390 V8. And this collector who bought it, when we took the car out to deliver it, he opens the gate that's behind his shop, and there are over 600 1964 Ford Galaxy 500s. He didn't offer why he had that many of them, and I thought it was probably impolite to ask, but they were just rows and rows and rows in this metal fenced-in area behind his shop. And I will tell you, when you collect cars, when you deal with vintage cars, you hear barn find stories all the time about, it became the joke about, the little old lady from Pasadena, in her little rickety garage, she had a brand new Superstock Dodge. I used to take those barn find stories with a healthy grain of salt before I moved to Texas. Now, if you've never lived there or spent time there, it's hard to understand the combination of empty space and generational wealth that leads to insane car collections and just oddities that you don't find in other places. I can tell you, in 1 year, in different purchases all over the state, and none of these are from collectors' auctions. These are all buying these cars from individuals. I found a 58 Packard Hawk, a 75 Bricklin SV1, a Manta Montage that was powered by a rotary Mazda engine, a Sterling Sebring, an 81 DeLorean, a 70 Chevelle 454 LS6 that had under 10,000 miles on it, original. It really was owned by a little old lady, interestingly enough. I found a 72 GTO 455 HO, verifiable one, a 70 Avanti, an 82 Trimuter, and a 73 Bremen Mini Mark. Now, those are just off the top of my head, and I'm not counting any of the there was a 428 Cobra Jet Cyclone. Speaking of 428 Cobra Jets, which we will be in a little bit. But at any rate, all of these were in these dusty old storage buildings or a garage of an abandoned house that people had finally decided to tear down. One of them had been in storage so long, I probably cleaned 2 trash cans full of pecan shells out of it, where vermin had been inside eating pecans for the last 40 years. Then there's another crazy thing that happened. There were these big old farms and ranches. And apparently, when people would get a new car, they'd just drive the old one out into one of the fields on the back of the property. And this family contacted me about clearing a bunch of old vehicles off of their property. And I get out there, and there are 2 or 3 cars for every decade starting in the mid-30s. I mean, it was astounding. And all of these cars are out there just rotting away in fields that nobody's ever going to know about. As I'm thinking about Jim Morrison's lost car, those kind of things are in the back of my mind. And then there's this coincidence that happened right at the same time that it kind of sealed the deal for me. This gentleman drove onto my lot in an Ivy Gold 68 Mustang Coupe. Now, it wasn't a very rare car. It was just a little 289 V8 with a 3-speed on the floor. But it was in great condition. And he pulls out this original title from 1969. And it seems that this car was traded in when it was about a year old, and this fellow bought it from the dealership and had owned it ever since. The car only had 12,000 some odd miles on the odometer, and from the condition, it was pretty clear that was correct. Now, as I started talking to this guy, I began to realize he was a real loner. I mean, his house was on a street that I drove down all the time, but I had never seen the car. And I have an eye for hidden cars. I'm always looking for a tail light or a headlight or anything I can ID peeking out of the back of a garage. And I had never noticed this really pretty little Mustang. And I was to discover that this was because it was always garaged or parked behind the house, and he really only left the house in it a few times a year. Now, let that settle. This man was in his 70s. He had no use for computer technology, and he was just happy being a hermit. He wasn't posting pictures of his car online. Think about how little exposure this 68 Mustang had to the outside world in the 36 years before it drove onto my lot. Now, there's a rush to say that any lost car was probably crushed, and millions of cars are crushed every year. But there are quite a few places besides a crusher that a car can end up, especially a rare car. Now, when I pitched this idea to my partner about a documentary search for Jim's lost Mustang. She was all in. We had both been Doors fans forever, but I'll admit my understanding of the subject was still pretty rudimentary. Now, that Stephen Davis biography of Jim had gone a long way to paint a picture of a guy who was a lot more complicated than the rock icon archetype of sex, drugs, booze, and an early death. Jim was a guy driven by multiple passions. He seemed to be aware of the architecture behind the way humans behave, and he liked to study it and figure out how to use it to his advantage. Now, he had a great band backing him up. He had a very strong partner throughout his career. He had a strong partner with a brain and a mouth. She was not shy, and Pam Corson, and Pam was his muse. And then he had this iconic car, this car that he got early in his career. He loved it enough to cast it in his short film project, make it one of the central parts. This car that disappeared in 1969, a car he had kept for years when just other possessions meant very little to him. I don't think it can be overstated how little Jim cared about most material things. Performers who are on the road are often given a per diem or a daily cash allowance so they don't have to deal with banks and that sort of thing. Back in this time, we didn't have ATM cards. You had to physically go into a bank to get cash. In old Hollywood, they called it warm, walking around money. But it was just a convenience that you did for performers. And if they handed Jim $100 per diem, he'd come back in an hour with $5 worth of trinkets he'd brought off people on the street for $100. And he'd probably give those away. There's a famous story about Jim and Andy Warhol. Now, Jim was very interested in Andy's work as they both liked experimental film. And they would talk anytime they were together in New York. So it just so happens they both end up at a party. This party was being thrown for the record label to celebrate Light My Fire Going Gold, which was a big deal. That was the first gold single for the Doors. And they went to Delmonico's, which is a nice restaurant in New York. And there's a wine cellar meeting area that was under the restaurant that's available for private parties. And this particular private party did have a policy change afterwards about how expensive the wines left there would be. Jim apparently sampled a lot of them, but that's not really an issue here. So Warhol is at this party and Morrison's there, and they're hanging out and talking. And during this party, Andy gives Jim a golden telephone, and it's a very ornate Louis XIV gold telephone, and it's a big deal. They even put that in the Doors movie. And what happens next in the movie actually happened. Jim's heading over to a friend's apartment to continue the party after Delmonico's shuts down. And as he's passing a homeless man on the street, he reaches down and hands him the golden telephone and just keeps walking along. Keeping the car, loving the car like this is out of character. When you study acting, you start to get really curious about why people do things. Now, there's the old joke of the ham actor dramatically asking, "What's my motivation?" Well, in reality, it doesn't work that way. A trained actor breaks down a character's actions to find out why they do them. That's true, but you have to do that yourself. Nobody tells you that. If you don't figure out why your character's doing what they're doing, it's not going to appear natural on screen. Now, it gets to be sort of an unconscious thing you do when you're reading a story or you're even just interacting with new people. You start trying to figure out what makes them tick. Why do they do what they do? For me, learning all the things that fit a person or a character's pattern is very important, because that's going to inform how they're going to react to others in the story. But more important to the depth of the character are the few things that don't fit that pattern. Those things will tell you where your character's heart lies. Now, perhaps it's a hardcore military policeman who builds boats in his basement, or a cannibal psychiatrist who's an expert in Renaissance art, or a psychedelic era rock star who gives away everything with no thought to the value of material goods. Yet he keeps his leather jeans, his concho belt, and his Mustang. Those are the things he keeps. And I needed to know why. Why that car? And after keeping and caring for it, caring for it in his own way, how did he lose it? Because somehow it feels like that's what happened. It feels like it was lost. Now, over the years, I've had to do provenance research on quite a few cars. A few of them had celebrity owners. One was at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Some were just very rare models that are often faked and have to be authenticated. So that sort of research, that's my wheelhouse. I'm good at doing that. Rarity, of course, helps. The more unique points you can check off, the better. And certain makes and models will even have a registry where their owners can sign up and let everyone know where card number XYZ is in the collector's world. Now, for some, it's a very short list. Last I heard, there are 39 Hemi Barracuda convertibles left in the world. Originally, I think there were 40 built. Now, if you're a collector and you have a 7-digit pocketbook for toys, you can probably find out who owns all 39. Now, Jim's car was a 67 Shelby GT500. There were only about 2,048 of those. It's not 39, but it's not a million. Now, Shelby owners also have a registry, and they do keep up with each other. They do also have some interesting holes in their information where this car is concerned. I'm going to murder a myth right here at the very beginning. And this myth never made sense anyway. Because as I started to get into the search for this car, I began with the knowns. I could see the car in Jim's short film Highway. There's multiple shots of the interior and exterior. So I can see how the car is optioned. And that's not really hard to do because Shelby didn't have a lot of options anyway. It was a purpose-built car, and it was pretty easy to tell what it did and didn't have. Now, one of the things Ford did really well was to describe their vehicle using the VIN code and the data plate. You could very quickly glance at these VIN codes that Ford provided and tell engine package, year. They were very consistent, and it made Ford cars easier to identify on the fly. Now, the way a VIN code is constructed, the last numbers are the only ones that are unique to a vehicle. For our purposes, Shelby uses a 13-digit VIN code with a 5-digit sequential number that will be unique to each car. So I was a little surprised when I saw there was this manufactured mysterious search for the VIN code of Jim's car. I had business relationships with a few Mustang specialists, and we sat down over coffee and we kind of puzzled about why the VIN was being hidden in these pictures of old registration cards and that sort of thing. There was a weird implication that if you could find the VIN code, you would find the car. Now, one of the things we knew is that the sequential serial number for Jim's car is 00939. That is not in dispute. It's a Shelby GT500 from 1967. And that is all you need to know to verify Jim's car. Period. No mystery. You can take a few minutes, look at the options, and fill out the rest of the VIN if you like. It's not going to get you anywhere. Any 1967 Shelby Mustang that has a VIN code that starts with 674 and ends with 00939 will be Jim's car. Knowing that number will not open any mysterious lock. So, with that bit of information, you can proceed to step 2. You can start searching registries and running VIN searches through public and subscription databases. But unless there's a registration of that VIN code in a state that has a searchable database, or it was registered at a time when it had a searchable database, if you don't have that, you're finding nothing. Now, if it's in a field somewhere and it hasn't been registered since 1973, no search in the world is going to find that. Now, when you first start doing research on cars, you're going to hear the year 1981 tossed out as the year it all became standardized. Now, that's kind of true. Automotive manufacturers did standardize on a 17-digit VIN code format. It's the same one we still use today. And you could tell who the manufacturer was, the country of manufacture, the year, that sort of thing, in a standard format. It was supposed to make things easier to track for stolen vehicles or fraudulently ID'd cars, that kind of thing. But there's a false suggestion that everything was instantly computerized and the glorious database of automotive knowledge began to be built with absolute fidelity. And the reality was, it was really a mishmash for quite a while. It took quite a bit of time to get old data into these databases, if they even did it. For vehicles that were already inoperable or were not currently on the road, you're not going to go back and search for dead registrations to put them in your database. And computers are also pretty basic in 1981, very rudimentary levels of computing. So all of this was very slow. I didn't think this was going to be an easy car to find because, there have been a lot of people looking for it already. Now you add the challenges I outlined above, and it did set a daunting task. But damn, what a fun one. Treasure hunting for a Legends only car. Did I mention that? Yeah, it was the only car Jim ever owned. Let me back up just a minute though. What we need to know first is how James Douglas Morrison came to be the registered owner of a brand new night mist blue Ford Shelby Mustang GT500 in October of 1967. Jim was a standard issue Navy brat, except for the fact his dad was high brass. He was in the command of the Vietnam Theater of War and a serious naval officer. Now, Jim rebelled, and as all good rebels do, he headed west. And that's going to be where our story begins. But it doesn't start on the Sunset Strip. It starts at UCLA Film School. Now, film is an art that could be taught as a course of study was a fairly new concept at UCLA. You had your French New Wave directors and your avant-garde Italians that were, coming up with new ways to tell stories with a camera. And, Jim already considered himself a student of people, and he was very interested in how you use imagery to tell a story. He wanted to make the characters in his films representational more than realistic. Now, Jim enrolled in the program and was doing okay, but reportedly dropped out after a film project fell apart in the projector due to some shoddy mechanical editing by Jim. And apparently the professor humiliated him in front of the class, and he walked out, and that was it. It was at UCLA that Jim would meet several people that would be with him through most of his journey. But the most important of those by far is Ray Manzarek. Now, Ray was a bit older than Jim. And though he was embracing the 60s, California counterculture, he had a prior degree in economics. So Ray was a bit more serious, but he saw a lot of talent in Jim. And he was reportedly pretty bummed when Jim left school. But as the legend goes, after Jim left UCLA, he would later run into Ray on the beach in Venice. Venice, California, that is. Now, Ray says, "What you been up to?" Jim says, "Writing poems and songs." Ray gets him to read one and says, "Let's start a rock band, man. We can make $1 million." Now, Ray was already a very talented keyboard player because apparently everybody in the late 60s had innate musical ability if they just believed in it hard enough. But seriously, no, Ray was really good. Through friends of Ray's, they would end up putting together the lineup that would become the Doors. When they got the guys together, it just worked. As they started rehearsing, it was gelling and just getting better and better. You had, this jazz drummer named John Dinsmore comes in and he starts throwing in these Latin beats under these mythologically vibrant lyrics. And this classically trained guitarist, Robbie Krieger, he's not only a very talented songwriter, but he could weave these amazing, beautiful, like Andalusian Spanish flamenco guitar rhythms just rolling through. And then here's Ray with electronic organ on one hand and playing a keyboard bass on the other, so they don't need a bass player. And Jim on vocals. Jim would occasionally handle a harmonica or a tambourine, but it was mostly just vocals for Jim. And he took a big chunk of the songwriting as well, because Jim had these notebooks full of poems and lyrics. He was obsessed with the uses of mythology, and he'd weave these images into a lot of the Doors songs. His poems would just be these lyrical interludes in the middle of a passage. Perfect example, the end, "The Killer Awoke at Dawn." That's just a poem he put together and threw it into the middle of the solo, or a guitar solo there in the middle. It's just beautiful. So, of course, they go through the inevitable phase of being their own worst enemies and pissing off club owners and record label people. And eventually, though, they do get a gig, a little dive on the Sunset Strip called the London Fog. And it's a crappy little place, but it's just down the street from Whiskey A Go-Go. So the booker from Whiskey A Go-Go, who happens to be an attractive female, comes down to the London Fog, and there are various stories about how exactly it went down, but at the end of it, the Doors were the opening house band at the Whiskey A Go-Go, and they had arrived. The Whiskey is where the Doors would break out. It's also where they would sign with Jack Holzman of Elektra Records. Now, that would set their career in motion. Now, the self-titled album was a hit. The first single, Break On Through, got lost in the charts, but Light My Fire, the second single, went to number 1 in July of 1967. Now, the following October, Jim took delivery of a Shelby GT500 Mustang from Stockton Quincy Ford in Los Angeles. Now, in the Davis biography of Morrison, there's a story about Jack Holzman giving the car to Jim as a gift. But in Holzman's own book, he says the gift that he gave Jim was actually a gold-plated get-out-of-jail-free card from a Monopoly set. I'm going to go with Holzman on this one, just because the car makes a much better story. If Jack's telling the one that doesn't make him look as cool, it's probably true. But either way, Jim now owned a Shelby Mustang. Now, what doesn't seem to be in question is where Jim got the idea for the car. Jim's hairstylist was a guy named Jay Sebring. Except, much like Jim, Jay had reinvented himself when he moved west. Jay was born Thomas J. Cummer. And yes, that is exactly like it sounds, but with a K. He joined the Navy and became a barber during the Korean War. Later, he moves out to Los Angeles and opens his own salon. Now, new life, he needs a new name, so he takes the name Jay from his middle initial and Sebring from the famous sports car track in Florida. Jay's salon was on the corner of Fairfax and Melrose, and often sitting out front was Jay's blue 1964 Shelby Cobra. By all reports, Jim loved that car, and he frequently asked Jay about it. That's something I've heard quite a few times, that Jim frequently asked about it. And I find that really interesting. I mean, to have heard those conversations. I mean, what did Jim Morrison ask about? What did he ask about? Go home, consider, and then come back and ask more about later. I mean, would we have been surprised at how mundane the conversation was or how unique? I think it's probably a bit of both. Something that it's really easy to forget when you're dealing with the 60s as a time period. The kids who were teens in the 60s were raised in the 50s. What counted as wild for them is probably a lot tamer than you think it is. I find that a lot of these people still had a very pragmatic streak running through them that would make them consider realistic things as much as ideological ones. Now, Jay had been dating Sharon Tate for a few years. He was in the film industry, and his salon was walking distance from the door's offices, so Jim could come down there and look at the car and ask about the car and hang out anytime he wanted to. And I'm also sure it didn't hurt Sebring's street cred to have Jim Morrison hanging out in his shop. Now, if you've heard Jay's name before, it's unfortunately probably not from this story. It would be from the story of the murders on Cielo Drive on August 9th in 1969. Several members of middle-aged ex-con Charles Manson's cult group paid a visit to the house. Now, the motive was never exactly clear, though there are a few theories that seem to fit the facts better than others. One is that Manson was trying to incite a race war by killing wealthy white people and making it appear to be a racially motivated crime. That's what the L.A. County prosecutor wrote in his book, Helter Skelter. Also possible Manson was trying to send a message to intimidate Terry Melcher, who used to live there. Melcher was a record producer that Dennis Wilson put Manson together with. Manson also considered himself a musician. Melcher took a pass on Manson's music, which infuriated Manson. Did not help that Melcher was also Doris Day's son, very legendary actor, son. So, yeah, he was the kind of child of privilege that Manson hated. So, this is also an option. Probably one of the more simple ones is that this was cover for Manson family member Bobby Beausoleil, who was in jail for murder. Beausoleil had killed a small-time drug dealer named Gary Hinman, and in a series of Dumb and Dumber moves, Manson managed to make the entire thing way worse by convincing Beausoleil to make the Hinman murder look like a racially motivated political crime instead of revenge for a drug deal, which is what it was. He told Beausoleil to write political messages on the walls in Hinman's blood. Now, Beausoleil is arrested on August 6, 1969. So, if a very similar murder happened while Beausoleil was in jail, it would clearly mean he was innocent, right? Seems like some Manson logic. But you can take your pick from any of the above. The important part of it to this story is that when the murderers came to Cielo Drive on August 9th, Jay Sebring was among the house guests there. Now, he and her Tate survived the attack, and for a lot of people, this marked the end of the 60s. I think they mean it was a turn back to the ugly and old and cruel after several youth-driven summers of love in a row. But for now, we're back in 1967, and all of our players are young and pretty and alive. So now we know a possible vector for the idea to buy the Shelby. And after picking it up in October, it's clear Jim drove it often. That dark blue Mustang fastback became a fixture around Hollywood. It's kind of funny, though, to think about how short the trip was from the Shelby factory to the showroom where Jim bought it. I mean, thinking about my LA map, it's like 5 or 6 miles as crow flies. Because until the end of 1967, Shelby Mustangs were built in Venice Beach, California. When you see those quintessential shots of beautiful tan people roller skating down the boardwalk past gift shops and street performers, that's generally Venice Beach. Now, it seems to be a coincidence that Jim Morrison spent his early days in Los Angeles staying at a friend's rooftop in Venice. Venice Beach was also where Jim and Ray ran into each other after film school. And when the Doors rented a rehearsal space, their very first one, it was on the beach in Venice. Ray said you walked out through these Mondrian panel doors and were standing in sand. So, and away for Jim Morrison, all roads lead through Venice Beach, California. Now, until Matt Damon put on a cowboy hat and starred in Ford v Ferrari, the people who knew Carroll Shelby's story were constrained pretty much to automotive enthusiasts. He is one of the most, if not the most, influential American performance car designer who ever lived. Shelby's got an interesting story. He started out as a driver, but he had a heart condition that would permanently take him out of the driver's seat in the late 50s. He said he was eating nitroglycerin pills so fast during the races, he just knew he was going to have a heart attack, and he wasn't worried about killing himself as much as he was about taking out other drivers. So he took that skill he had as a driver and as a mechanic and a builder and turned it strictly to the builder's side of the table. And he didn't really, invent anything new. He just took the old hot rodder's idea of taking the biggest engine you can find and put it into the lightest car possible. And he tried to bring that to the world of production cars. Sort of. He found a very light chassis from British automaker AC. The British sports car is not the American or Italian idea of a sports car. British sports cars are generally very lightweight, with a moderately powered engine rather than a high revving or engine like you see out of the Italians or the big torquey motors that you tend to get out of American sports cars. But this little AC, it was a tube frame car. It had an aluminum body. It was light. And it had been built to house a fairly weak 6-cylinder. And AC was losing access to that 6-cylinder motor. They were just a chassis builder. So when Shelby shows up, this seems like a good idea to them as well. And they set the chassis up with the measurements that Shelby brings them, and they work it out where they can install Ford's new Windsor small block V8 engine that's coming out then in the Fairlane, I believe, was where they introduced that one. It was a little 260 V8, and they were going to sit that in the AC's frame, and that was going to be a small block V8 in this tiny light car. So they get all the measurements done. They get it all put together. The car is shipped back to Shelby's shop. He puts in the motor and the transmission, and the Shelby Cobra is born. The first cars had that little 260 V8. Pretty soon, though, they bumped the motor up to 289 cubic inches, and that's what the next generation of Cobras will be powered by, until you get into the later ones that get all the way up to the 427 big block. The 427 AC Cobras are the ones you see with the much larger grille opening. It's the one that most of the kit cars are based on. Now, the early work that Shelby did with Ford on both the Cobras and on Ford's racing program would lead to the collaboration that would create the Shelby Mustang. Now, Ford introduced the Mustang as a mid-year model in 1964. And Shelby was ready with a Shelby Hot modified version of the car for 1965. If you got the Shelby, they took the K-Code 289 V8 that from Ford produced 271 horsepower. It was a solid lifter motor with a little more aggressive cam, I believe. Adding the Shelby high-rise intake and a bigger Holley 4-barrel carburetor brought the horsepower up to 306. Now, the Shelby got a fiberglass hood with a functional hood scoop. There were steel exhaust headers that fed into true dual exhaust that exited ahead of the rear tires, and it got larger brakes from the Galaxy full-size line. And in 1965, you could get a Shelby in any color you wanted, as long as that color was Wimbledon white with blue stripes. Now, you did get the Goodyear Blue Dot 130-mile-an-hour tires, which was a big deal. And if you decided, hey, I want to go racing, you could order the Shelby GT350R, which was set up to go SCCA B production class racing from the factory. 350 horsepower, special lightweight package, including an aluminum frame and plexiglass side windows. You could take a race car home from Shelby in 1965. Now, that 65 success got 66 off to a good start, and Mr. Shelby was starting to flex a bit of muscle. The GT350 added a hood-mounted tack and true tubular headers with dual exhausts that now exited at the rear. But they started adding a lot more go-fast options to the small block motor. You could get a variety of different intakes, and you could go all the way up to a Shelby-tuned Paxton supercharger setup. Only very few were ordered with that because it was pretty expensive, but that is a super rare one if you find one. Now, car magazines loved the Shelby. I mean, it was everywhere. Shelby had some innovative advertising, and he was a personable guy. He knew how to give the magazines access to the cars so that they'd write about them, and it was a huge success. So in 1967, they decided, let's introduce a new one. The small block Shelby gets a big brother in the GT500. Now, that GT500 Mustang was a monster. It got the 428 cubic inch V8 with dual Holley 4-barrel carbs. That's producing somewhere probably significantly north of the advertised 335 horsepower. You got a functional Ram Air fiberglass hood with a matching fiberglass rear deck lid with a molded in spoiler. The interior was nicely appointed for a road-going race car. You had a factory roll bar that the harnesses were hung from in the back. You had a wood steering wheel, and you could get your choice of white or black interior. The white they called parchment. Now, the other big choice was a 4-speed manual or 3-speed automatic transmission. Now, a base fastback Mustang in 1967 would cost around $2,600. The GT500 the same year was $4,200. Man, that was an upgrade that not many people could afford. Now, getting back to Jim Morrison's car, Jim's car had a few interesting options. It had all the normal, GT500 goodies, but in general, although the Le Mans racing stripes, the 2 racing stripes that go over the roof and hood, were an option, they were almost always on the Shelby cars, and on Jim's car, they're not. They did not put the Le Mans stripes on it. We know it was a 4-speed car. It did not have air conditioning. It was dark blue or night mist blue with parchment interior. Now, on Jim's car, the Shelby driving lights that were kind of a signature for the 1967 they're mounted in the center of the grille. But Jim had been working on a film script for a while, and in the script there were several archetypal figures that would meet around a campfire. One of them is the woman known as the Blue Lady. Now, Jim would transfer the name of this character to his beloved Mustang, and that would make it forever part of his legend.
This is the end of the episode, but it's not the end of the story. In this series, I'll cover all aspects of my nearly 20-year search for this car. You'll hear about the people I met along the way and the stories they have to tell about Jim and his car. And these aren't second-hand stories, but tales of people who sat beside Jim in the car. Now, there are multiple people who claim they've found it. There are many people who've tried to make themselves part of the story. There are myths, and then there are facts. Unfortunately, my health is failing. And so I decided to turn the research for the documentary film into this podcast. Now, I'll do my best to get future episodes out in a timely manner. And if you'd like to help with production so that episodes come out sooner, you can. And you'll get some great bonus material too. Just go to patreon.com/Morrison's Mustang. There's a link in the show notes as well. Anyone who donates $5 or more will get access to bonus episodes that will come out during the series. These will include Errors in the Doors movie, the wildest uncorroborated stories that I don't think can really be part of the main story, behind-the-scenes stories from my years as a picture car coordinator, inside the crazy relationship between Carroll Shelby and Henry Ford II, who was known as Hank Deuce, and many more great stories. This is a journey I've never regretted taking, and I'm very pleased to be sharing it with you. Until the next episode, I'm Leo Mixon. Thank you.